My name is Jonathan Weber, a diplomat of American nationality, though my roots trace back to Central Europe. I was born into a family where ideas, debate, and a sense of duty to the world were as commonplace as breakfast. My father served as an ambassador in several European capitals, his life a constant rotation of formal dinners, confidential meetings, and late-night negotiations. My mother, on the other hand, was an international journalist, often reporting from conflict zones, her stories, a window into the suffering and resilience of people caught in the crossfire. I followed in their footsteps, but in my own way. After completing my studies in international relations and international law at an Ivy League university, I joined the United Nations, participating in peace conferences and observing firsthand the delicate balancing act required to maintain diplomacy. My upbringing and professional experiences shaped me into someone methodical, cautious, and deeply empathetic to the human cost of conflict. I have always believed in the power of dialogue and negotiation, that even amidst the chaos of war, understanding and reason can prevail. It was late September 1973, and the world seemed poised on the edge of uncertainty. Tensions in the Middle East had been simmering for years, but now the danger felt imminent. Israel and its neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, were entangled in a web of unresolved grievances, territorial disputes, and past wars that had left deep scars. The ceasefire agreements from previous conflicts were fragile, and rumors of military mobilizations and secret plans spread quickly through diplomatic channels. From my office at the United Nations headquarters, I followed every report with a growing sense of urgency. Intelligence briefings arrived daily, detailing troop movements across the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, while news outlets relayed stories of border skirmishes and escalating rhetoric from political leaders. It was a tense prelude to what many feared would erupt into full-scale war. I understood that my role was not merely to observe, but to prepare for direct engagement, to stand at the intersection of negotiation and conflict. The weight of potential failure pressed upon me. Even a small misstep could have catastrophic consequences for both soldiers and civilians. As I reviewed maps, memorandums, and historical records of the region, I felt the enormity of the challenge ahead. This was no abstract exercise in diplomacy. It was a matter of life and death, of preserving fragile peace in a region that had known far too much suffering already. As I prepared for what lay ahead, I constantly reminded myself why I had chosen this path. My motivation was simple yet profound: to maintain peace, and if possible, to save lives. The civilians caught in the crossfire, families fleeing their homes, children who had known nothing but fear, these faces haunted my thoughts. Diplomacy, I believe, was not an abstract pursuit of policy or protocol. It was a lifeline for those who had no voice in the corridors of power. At the same time, I was acutely aware of the political pressures surrounding me. The U.S. government expected results, alliances had to be maintained, and each word spoken could ripple across international relations. Every decision carried weight, every negotiation a potential turning point. I knew I had to balance the idealism instilled in me by my upbringing with the stark realities of wartime politics. Despite the anxiety gnawing at me, there was a quiet resolve beneath it, a determination to act with integrity, to approach each conversation, each briefing, and each strategy session with clarity and empathy. My aim was not only to fulfill my duty as a diplomat, but to embody the hope that reason and dialogue could prevail where bullets and bombs threatened to dominate. In that fragile space between war and negotiation, I found my purpose. I quickly realized that the path ahead would be anything but straightforward. The leaders I was to engage with, military commanders, political representatives, and senior diplomats from both Israel and the Arab states, were resolute, often inflexible, and deeply suspicious of each other. Every meeting promised a test of patience, tact, and strategic thinking. A single misstep in phrasing or timing could unravel hours of careful negotiation and inflame tensions further. Meanwhile, the pressure from my own government was relentless. Washington expected tangible outcomes, reports that demonstrated progress, and reassurances that the United States could manage the delicate balance between supporting allies and advocating for peace. Beyond that, international media coverage added another layer of scrutiny. Every action and statement had the potential to spark headlines that might complicate diplomatic efforts. I felt the weight of these expectations pressing down on me, a constant reminder that diplomacy was a high-stakes endeavor. Yet within this pressure, I sensed the magnitude of the opportunity, the chance to influence the course of events, to prevent unnecessary suffering, and to assert that reasoned negotiation still mattered in a world teetering on the brink of war. As I gathered my notes and reviewed the upcoming agendas, I knew that the challenges ahead would test every skill I had acquired, every lesson my upbringing and education had taught me, and every ounce of courage I could muster. Despite the meticulous preparation and strategic planning, a quiet unease lingered within me. I could not shake the thought that all my careful calculations might still fall short, that the human cost of failure could be devastating. The weight of responsibility pressed on my chest each morning as I reviewed maps and communiques, a constant reminder that behind every negotiation table sat lives hanging in the balance. I found myself torn between the ideals I had been raised with and the harsh realities I was about to confront. My upbringing had instilled in me a belief that dialogue could prevail, that empathy and reason could bridge even the deepest divides. Yet the looming specter of war made that belief feel tenuous. How could words matter when tanks were rolling, artillery shells were fired, and families lived in fear of the next strike? Even as doubt crept in, it fueled a sharper focus. I resolved to carry the weight of my responsibility with clarity and purpose, to remember that diplomacy was not merely about policy, but about preserving humanity amid chaos. Every hesitation, every decision, every word spoken would ripple far beyond the room I occupied. I understood then that the path ahead would demand courage, not the bravery of battle, but the steadfastness of conviction and the willingness to act with integrity in the face of uncertainty. Finally, the moment arrived when my assignment was confirmed. I would be sent directly to the heart of the conflict to engage in negotiations that could determine the fate of countless lives. The weight of that responsibility was immediate and overwhelming. A mixture of anxiety, anticipation, and determination coursed through me. I knew that the days ahead would test every skill I had acquired, every lesson instilled by my parents, and every ounce of patience I could muster. The room where I would first meet the delegations, the words I would choose, the subtle gestures and silences, all would carry consequences far beyond my own understanding. As I packed the final documents and double-checked the intelligence briefings, a singular thought crystallized in my mind. The coming journey would not only challenge my abilities as a diplomat, but also confront me with the stark realities of war. There would be obstacles, deadlocks, and moral dilemmas, yet within them lay the fragile possibility of peace. The morning I received the official orders from the U.S. Department of State is etched vividly in my memory. I was summoned to a quiet office, the weight of the documents in my hands already signaling the gravity of the task ahead. My assignment was clear. I was to travel directly to the heart of the conflict, to participate in negotiations that could influence the course of a war teetering on the edge of escalation. A mixture of excitement and anxiety coursed through me as I considered what lay ahead. The thrill of being entrusted with such a critical mission was tempered by the sobering realization of the potential consequences. One misstep, one poorly chosen word could endanger lives and compromise fragile diplomatic channels. I felt the heavy responsibility of representing not only my country, but also the ideals of reason, dialogue, and human decency. I spent the day meticulously preparing. Maps of the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights were spread across my desk, annotated with troop positions, supply lines, and key checkpoints. Intelligence briefs were reviewed and cross-referenced with historical accounts of prior conflicts in the region. I packed essential documents, notes, and personal items with care, aware that every detail mattered. As I paused to reflect, I reminded myself to remain calm, focused, and deliberate. The chaos of war would test every skill I had cultivated, and only through careful thought and measured action could I hope to navigate the coming days. In that quiet moment of preparation, I steeled myself for the delicate balance of diplomacy and the harsh realities that awaited. The journey to the center of the conflict began before dawn, the city still shrouded in a pale, sleepy light. Boarding the aircraft, I was struck by the assortment of passengers, military attachés, reviewing their notes, journalists, clutching cameras and notebooks, and fellow diplomats, murmuring in hushed tones about intelligence reports and potential outcomes. The hum of the engines seemed to echo the tension in the cabin, a quiet reminder that we were not merely traveling but stepping into the eye of a gathering storm. As we flew over the Mediterranean, I traced the coastline with my eyes, trying to familiarize myself with the geography that would soon become a theater of intense negotiation and human suffering. Villages, roads, and sparse fields stretched below, seemingly tranquil, yet poised on the brink of upheaval. Each passing moment brought me closer to the reality that awaited a region scarred by previous conflicts, where lives and livelihoods could be altered in an instant. Upon arrival, the first sights were stark and unsettling. The airport, though operational, bore subtle signs of strain heightened, security soldiers stationed at every corner, and vehicles loaded with supplies and communications equipment. As we drove toward our temporary headquarters, I glimpsed damaged structures and the cautious movements of civilians, their expressions betraying both fear and resignation. The proximity of destruction impressed upon me the immense responsibility resting on my shoulders. Every decision I would make, every word spoken at the negotiating table could ripple far beyond the walls of that city, affecting countless lives. In that moment, I understood that diplomacy in a war zone demanded vigilance, empathy, and unyielding composure. The first meeting with the delegations was unlike anything I had experienced before. Entering the conference room, the air felt thick with suspicion and unspoken tension. Representatives from Israel sat on one side, their posture, rigid eyes sharp and expressions guarded. Across the table, the Arab delegates mirrored the same vigilance, their demeanor, a careful blend of authority and caution. Every handshake, every nod seemed laden with calculated meaning, as if a single gesture could betray weakness or invite mistrust. I introduced myself with measured words, mindful of the delicate balance in the room. "I am Jonathan Weber, representing the United States," I said, striving for calm and neutrality in both tone and posture. Observing reactions, I noted subtle cues, the brief flicker of acknowledgement, the tightening of a jaw, a wary glance exchanged between colleagues. These small details I knew could reveal intentions far beyond spoken language. As the meeting progressed, I listened more than I spoke, allowing each delegate to outline their priorities, concerns, and red lines. The Israelis emphasized security and territorial integrity, while the Arab representatives underscored the urgency of reclaiming occupied lands and addressing civilian suffering. I took copious notes, mentally cataloging points of agreement, potential compromises, and areas where further persuasion would be required. Amid the tension, there were fleeting moments of humanity. A delegate paused to sip tea, another smiled briefly at a shared anecdote, and I found small openings to acknowledge shared concerns about civilian casualties. These glimpses reminded me that behind the rigid facades were individuals capable of empathy even in the midst of conflict. By the end of the session, I felt the weight of responsibility settle even deeper. The room was a crucible of diplomacy where every word, expression, and silence carried consequences. I left with a clear understanding of the challenges ahead, bridging profound mistrust, navigating divergent objectives, and maintaining the fragile hope that dialogue could somehow avert further bloodshed. After the initial meetings, I retreated to a quieter room to organize the materials that would guide my actions in the coming days. Maps of the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights were spread across the table, each annotated with troop positions, supply routes, and strategic choke points. Intelligence briefs were stacked neatly, cross-referenced with field reports and historical data. Every detail mattered. Even a small oversight could compromise the delicate balance of negotiations. My task was clear, yet formidable, to facilitate discussions aimed at reducing immediate hostilities while preserving long-term diplomatic objectives. I reviewed the objectives set by the U.S., government prioritizing measures that could prevent civilian casualties and secure temporary ceasefires. Notes from military advisors highlighted the urgency of certain regions, while analysts flagged potential points of friction that might derail talks. As I compiled my strategy, I consulted closely with my assistant and the experts who would accompany me. We discussed contingency plans, potential objections from both sides, and ways to frame proposals that might be acceptable without appearing biased. Every suggestion was weighed carefully. The stakes were high, and miscalculations could have dire consequences. The gravity of the situation settled over me as I packed the final documents. These were not merely reports or maps. They were instruments through which lives could be safeguarded or endangered. I reminded myself to remain calm, measured, and deliberate. The coming meetings would test every skill I had cultivated, every lesson learned from my upbringing and training. I understood that my role was not just to observe, but to actively shape the course of events, navigating a path through distrust, conflicting agendas, and the ever-present shadow of war. In that quiet preparation, I steeled myself for the trials ahead, knowing that every word and action could ripple far beyond the confines of the room. Before departing, I made time to see my family one last time. The farewell was quiet, almost subdued, each of us acutely aware of the gravity of the situation. My father clasped my shoulder, his eyes betraying both pride and worry. "Remember, Jonathan," he said, "words can be as powerful as any weapon. Choose them wisely." My mother, ever the journalist, pressed a hand to my cheek and whispered a reminder to observe record and never forget the human faces behind every statistic. We exchanged letters we had written in advance, each one a mixture of encouragement, advice, and concern. I handed her a folded note I had prepared, outlining the hope I carried that diplomacy might prevent further bloodshed. Reading her reply, I felt a mixture of warmth and apprehension. She acknowledged the danger, but reminded me of the importance of integrity and composure. As I left the house, the familiar streets of my childhood blurred past, replaced by the looming reality of the mission ahead. The weight of responsibility pressed upon me. This was more than an assignment. It was a test of character, skill, and resilience. Every decision I would make, every interaction with delegates and military personnel would echo far beyond the negotiation table. In that moment, I silently vowed to carry the lessons and values instilled by my family into every conversation, every compromise, and every challenge that awaited me in the heart of a region on the brink of war. While settling into my temporary quarters, I made it a priority to review the unfolding military situation. Reports from the field painted a vivid and unsettling picture. Egyptian forces had launched a coordinated offensive across the Sinai Peninsula, while Syrian troops advanced on the Golan Heights. Israeli units, caught off guard by the timing of the attack during Yom Kippur, scrambled to reinforce defensive positions. The initial clashes were intense, with artillery exchanges and armored movements signaling that this conflict would escalate quickly. Through intelligence briefings and sporadic communications from military liaisons, I tracked troop movements, supply lines, and casualty reports. The maps before me were no longer abstract. Each notation represented towns under threat roads, blocked by military maneuvers and civilians attempting to flee combat zones. It was a stark reminder that behind every negotiation point and strategic decision lay human lives hanging in the balance. I spent hours cross-referencing the reports with historical accounts of prior engagements in the region, trying to anticipate patterns and outcomes. Key battles, small yet decisive, began to emerge as indicators of how diplomatic leverage might be applied. The fluidity of the situation meant that plans could change within hours, making adaptability as crucial as knowledge. Even in the midst of such intensity, I sought to maintain perspective. I reflected on how the events I was observing would shape every discussion at the negotiation table. Each ceasefire proposal or compromise would be informed not just by political considerations, but by the realities of the battlefield. The juxtaposition of strategy and human consequence was stark. A commander's tactical choice in the field could determine whether a civilian village remained intact or was caught in crossfire. These realizations deepened my resolve, reminding me that diplomacy was inseparable from the tangible human stakes of war. Amid the relentless flow of information and the weight of responsibility, I found brief moments of human connection that reminded me why diplomacy mattered. During discussions with my assistant, we shared quiet sips of tea while reviewing intelligence, allowing ourselves short breaths amidst the tension. These small rituals offered fleeting solace, a chance to reflect on the gravity of our work and the lives affected by every decision. Interactions with fellow diplomats were equally revealing. Heated debates, carefully measured words, and subtle gestures created a web of negotiation that demanded both patience and attentiveness. I learned to read not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. A pause, a glance, the slightest change in tone, all could signal a shift in priorities or the willingness to compromise. Even in these moments of pressure, my thoughts often drifted to the civilians caught in the conflict. Conversations occasionally turned to humanitarian concerns, and I found opportunities to advocate for measures that could minimize harm to non-combatants. It was a delicate balance, maintaining professional detachment while honoring the human dimension of war. Through these interactions, I became increasingly aware of the duality of my role navigating the cold mechanics of strategy and protocol while remaining attuned to empathy and moral responsibility. Each dialogue, each negotiation reinforced the lesson that diplomacy in the midst of conflict required not only intellect and strategy, but also a steadfast commitment to humanity. As the initial meetings and preparations drew to a close, I sensed the magnitude of the challenges that lay ahead. The delegations had made their positions clear, and the deep-seated mistrust between the sides was palpable. Reports of escalating clashes on the Sinai and Golan fronts underscored that time was not on our side. The window to influence outcomes and prevent further casualties was narrowing by the hour. I reviewed my notes once more, anticipating potential deadlocks, unexpected objections, and the inevitable moments when diplomacy would collide with harsh military realities. Every negotiation point, every carefully chosen phrase would carry consequences far beyond the room in which we met. I felt the pressure settle over me like a tangible weight, a reminder that my role was both critical and precarious. In that quiet moment of reflection, I understood that the coming days would test not only my skill as a diplomat, but also my moral compass and emotional resilience. The true battle had yet to begin, not on the battlefield, but across the negotiation table, where words would determine the lives of countless civilians and soldiers alike. The first formal negotiation brought me face to face with the full weight of the conflict. Entering the main conference room, I was immediately struck by the atmosphere, heavy, tense, and charged with unspoken hostility. Delegates from Israel occupied one side of the long table, their posture, rigid expressions, taut eyes scanning the room with a calculated wariness. Across from them, the Arab representatives mirrored the same vigilance, their every movement deliberate, their gazes sharp and unwavering. From the outset, it was clear that compromise would not come easily. As the session commenced, positions were stated firmly and without concession. The Israeli delegation emphasized the necessity of securing borders and ensuring military advantages, their tone measured but unmistakably inflexible. The Arab delegates, equally resolute, pressed for the immediate reclamation of occupied territories and swift measures to protect civilians in frontline areas. Each statement seemed designed to test resolve, to measure the limits of patience and flexibility on both sides. I took my seat, carefully aware that my role was to mediate, to temper the rigidity with reason, and to maintain a neutral presence. I listened intently, choosing words with deliberate care whenever I spoke, offering small gestures of acknowledgement or understanding without implying alignment. Every nod, every pause, every glance was calculated. The slightest misstep could be interpreted as bias or weakness. Watching the subtle cues of body language, the tightening of a jaw, a fleeting glance between colleagues, the way hands rested on the table, I tried to gauge where pressure points existed, where there might be room for tentative negotiation. Internally, a knot of anxiety grew. I was acutely aware that the success or failure of this dialogue could influence not only diplomatic outcomes, but the lives of countless civilians and soldiers. Despite the tension, I reminded myself to remain composed, to breathe, and to observe. This was not a battlefield of weapons, but one of words, influence, and perception. My fear of failure coexisted with a cautious determination. If I could navigate this crucible with clarity and empathy, perhaps I could find a sliver of common ground where dialogue might prevail. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed down relentlessly, making each moment both vital and precarious. Between negotiation sessions, I retreated to a small office where intelligence reports and field briefings awaited. The stark realities of the battlefield, previously abstract in my mind, now demanded full attention. Egyptian forces had crossed the Suez Canal, establishing positions deep within the Sinai Peninsula, while Syrian units pressed hard on the Golan Heights. Israeli troops scrambled to mount counteroffensives, reinforcing vulnerable sectors and coordinating artillery strikes. The pace of events left no room for hesitation. Every development required careful interpretation and immediate consideration of its diplomatic implications. I pored over satellite imagery maps and first-hand reports from military attachés. Towns and villages previously represented by mere dots on a page now became populated with human lives at stake. Roads blocked by armored convoys, bridges destroyed to slow advancement, and makeshift refugee routes all underscored the vulnerability of civilians in the crossfire. With each update, the stakes of our diplomatic efforts crystallized. Negotiations were not abstract exercises, they were lifelines that could prevent further bloodshed. I discussed the intelligence with my assistant, debating how to leverage this information during the next round of talks. Could we use reports of civilian suffering to prompt concessions? How much could we reveal without alienating one side or appearing manipulative? These questions weighed heavily, forcing me to reconcile my commitment to humanity with the hard realities of strategy and persuasion. Even as exhaustion threatened, I reminded myself to maintain objectivity and clarity. Each piece of information had to be integrated into a broader understanding of the conflict's trajectory, anticipating how battlefield developments might shift priorities and bargaining positions. The juxtaposition of raw military data and the delicacy of negotiation highlighted the dual nature of my role. I was simultaneously observer, analyst, mediator, and moral witness. As the afternoon wore on, the battlefield updates reinforced one undeniable truth: every decision made at the table, every carefully worded suggestion carried immediate and far-reaching consequences. The lives of soldiers and civilians alike were entwined with the success of diplomacy, and the pressure to act wisely and ethically was relentless. In that quiet office surrounded by maps and reports, I felt the sobering weight of responsibility settle more heavily than ever before. Amid the flurry of intelligence briefings and negotiation strategies, reports of human suffering arrived with increasing frequency. Photographs of damaged homes, injured civilians, and makeshift shelters filled my office screen, each image a stark reminder that the conflict's consequences extended far beyond troop movements and territorial gains. Families were torn from their homes, children wandered in fear, and hospitals strained under the weight of casualties. It was one thing to study maps and tactical charts. It was another entirely to witness the real human toll laid bare before me. I felt an ache of helplessness that no amount of preparation could erase. Sitting across from my assistant, we shared grim observations in hushed tones, speaking of the families whose lives had been abruptly shattered. Every casualty is a story, I murmured, and each story carries a consequence for our negotiations. The weight of these truths made the task before me more urgent but also infinitely more complicated. How could I balance the cold calculus of diplomacy with the pressing moral imperative to safeguard civilians? During a brief respite, I opened my journal and scribbled notes and letters that I might never send, thoughts about fear, guilt, and the hope that dialogue could alleviate some suffering. I reflected on the faces of the displaced, imagining the children clutching makeshift belongings, the elderly too frail to flee, and the mothers who grieved for those lost. These moments of personal reflection were sobering, forcing me to confront the stark contrast between my ideals and the grim reality unfolding on the ground. Even as fatigue gnawed at my resolve, I recognized the necessity of maintaining composure. Each encounter with delegates, each carefully chosen word, had the potential to either mitigate or exacerbate the human cost. The images of destruction and despair served as a constant reminder diplomacy in wartime was not merely an exercise of strategy, but an ethical endeavor, a commitment to humanity in the midst of chaos. In the quiet intensity of that office, I stilled myself, knowing that every decision I made would ripple far beyond the conference room and into the lives of countless innocents caught in the crossfire. The following negotiation session quickly escalated into a full-blown crisis. From the outset, it was clear that neither side was willing to yield. The Israeli delegation insisted on strict security guarantees and control over strategic points, while the Arab representatives demanded immediate concessions and humanitarian measures that, in their view, Israel had long ignored. The room crackled with tension, voices rose and fell, punctuated by sharp glances and pointed gestures. I intervened carefully, choosing my words to de-escalate the tension without compromising neutrality. Let us consider the humanitarian implications while we discuss security. I suggested maintaining a calm tone and measured gestures. Yet every attempt to mediate was met with skepticism. Delegates questioned the accuracy of reports, the intentions behind proposals, and even the reliability of each other's statements. Rumors and conflicting intelligence fed the mistrust, creating an environment where progress seemed almost impossible. The pressure intensified as each minute passed. I could feel the weight of expectations from my government pressing down, reminding me that failure here would not be abstract. It would mean more lives lost, more cities under fire, and possibly the escalation of a broader conflict. Every objection, every interruption, and every insistence on maximalist positions had to be navigated with tact, diplomacy, and strategic patience. During brief pauses, I conferred with my assistant and advisors, recalibrating approaches and exploring alternative framing of proposals. The delicate balance between assertiveness and empathy became ever more crucial. Internally, I wrestled with frustration and fatigue. The idealistic vision of diplomacy as a straightforward path to peace clashed with the messy, entrenched realities before me. Yet despite the impasse, I reminded myself that even small shifts, a softened stance here, a concession frame there, could pave the way for incremental progress. Each carefully considered word was a potential bridge over the chasm of distrust. The room remained charged, but within the tension lay the faint glimmer of possibility that patience, observation, and strategic empathy might yet create openings for meaningful dialogue amidst the chaos of war. As the negotiation sessions stretched into days, the relentless pace began to take its toll. Sleep became a scarce commodity, and meals were often skipped or eaten hastily between briefings. Each new report brought fresh anxieties, conflicting intelligence, unexpected troop movements, and civilian casualties that seemed to mount by the hour. The sheer weight of responsibility pressed on me, a constant reminder that, Failure here would not be theoretical, it would be tangible, measured in human lives. One evening, a particularly alarming intelligence brief arrived. Conflicting reports suggested a sudden escalation in a contested zone of the Sinai, with artillery fire reaching areas previously thought secure. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. The Arab delegation had threatened to withdraw from talks if their demands were not acknowledged, while Israeli commanders insisted on uncompromising security measures. I realized that any misstep on my part could trigger a diplomatic breakdown, potentially inflaming the military situation further. Exhaustion blurred the edges of judgment. My mind raced, balancing moral responsibility against practical necessity. I reflected on the ethical implications of every word I had spoken, every proposal I had framed. Could a slight hesitation or misstatement cost lives? The thought was almost unbearable, yet it underscored the gravity of my role. I was not just negotiating abstract points on a map. I was a conduit between human suffering and the fragile hope of resolution. In moments of solitude, I wrote in my journal, trying to process the fear, fatigue, and ethical dilemmas that the intense pace of negotiations had stirred. I recorded observations, contemplated potential strategies, and reminded myself of the values instilled by my family, the importance of patience, integrity, and empathy. These personal reflections became both an anchor and a compass, helping me maintain clarity amidst chaos. By the next day, I returned to the table with renewed focus, aware that the coming hours would test not only my diplomatic skills, but also my emotional resilience. The pressure was immense, the stakes higher than ever, and yet in that crucible of stress and uncertainty, I understood that perseverance, careful judgment, and moral vigilance were the only tools I had to navigate the storm. Amid the relentless intensity of negotiations and the constant influx of troubling intelligence, rare moments of human connection provided a fleeting sense of relief. During a brief pause between sessions, my assistant and I sat together over lukewarm tea, reviewing notes, and quietly discussing the impact of recent developments on civilian populations. These small, mundane rituals offered a necessary respite, a chance to breathe, reflect, and reaffirm why we were there. In these moments, I found myself thinking less about strategy and more about the individuals behind the reports. Children huddled in makeshift shelters, families separated by advancing front lines, and the elderly struggling to find safety. I shared these observations with my assistant, our conversation straying from tactical considerations to the ethical responsibility we bore. Even within the sterile walls of a conference room, the weight of the human cost was ever present, a constant reminder that diplomacy was inseparable from the welfare of those caught in the crossfire. Later, a brief exchange with a junior delegate from one of the Arab countries revealed a shared concern over civilian suffering. Though formal positions remained rigid for a moment, the conversation transcended politics, highlighting the universal empathy that could survive even in the harshest circumstances. These fleeting glimpses of common humanity rekindled a sense of hope, a belief that even small gestures, careful wording, and attentive listening could ease some of the burden of conflict. Such moments reinforced my understanding that diplomacy was as much about moral responsibility as it was about tactical negotiation. Each word, each gesture, and each choice held consequences for real lives. Amid the tension, these pockets of humanity reminded me why perseverance mattered, that even in the darkest hours, the principles of empathy, compassion, and ethical conduct could guide decisions and preserve the fragile possibility of peace. As the days of intense negotiation wore on, a clearer understanding of the true nature of war and diplomacy began to crystallize within me. I realized that the theoretical ideals I had carried into the mission, the belief that dialogue alone could resolve conflict, were constantly tested against the harsh realities of human behavior, strategic imperatives, and the unpredictability of violence. The battlefield reports, civilian casualties, and intransigent positions of the delegations underscored that diplomacy was never abstract. It was intrinsically entwined with the consequences of action or inaction. Every decision, every carefully measured phrase carried weight far beyond the room in which I stood. I became acutely aware that words could escalate or de-escalate tensions just as effectively as military maneuvers. The subtleties of tone, timing, and gesture were not mere formalities. They were instruments capable of shaping perceptions, influencing choices, and in some cases, preserving lives. This realization deepened my respect for the craft of negotiation as well as my understanding of its limits. At the same time, I confronted the moral dilemmas inherent in my role. Could I justify advocating for a compromise that might temporarily disadvantage one side if it prevented greater harm? How could I maintain integrity and neutrality while acknowledging the human suffering on both sides? These questions haunted my reflections during brief respites, yet they also reinforced my commitment to acting with empathy, honesty, and strategic foresight. The experience instilled in me a profound sense of responsibility, not only to my government and the delegations, but to the civilians and soldiers whose lives were directly affected by our discussions. Diplomacy, I understood, was a delicate balance, a mixture of intellect, patience, and moral courage. Through the intensity of these negotiations, I came to appreciate that the measure of a diplomat was not only in achieving agreements, but in bearing witness to the human cost of war and striving to mitigate it wherever possible. By the end of this phase, I felt a transformation within myself, an acute awareness of the stakes involved, the ethical complexities of decision-making, and the enduring necessity of compassion, even in the midst of conflict. It was a lesson that would shape every action in the remainder of the mission. As the second phase of negotiations drew to a close, a tenuous sense of progress emerged, though the fragility of it was undeniable. Preliminary agreements had been sketched out, concessions tentatively accepted, yet the underlying mistrust between delegations remained as sharp as ever. The battlefield continued to shift unpredictably, and each movement of troops or flare-up in civilian zones reminded me that the window for meaningful diplomacy was perilously narrow. I reviewed the day's outcomes with my assistant, noting areas where positions had softened slightly and points that remained immovable. The weight of responsibility pressed even more heavily now as I understood that the next rounds of talks would demand not only strategic acumen, but also moral courage. Decisions taken in the coming hours could avert or accelerate disaster, influencing not only the lives of soldiers, but of countless civilians caught in the conflict. Internally, I braced myself for the moral and ethical challenges ahead. Deadlocks, unexpected crises, and difficult compromises awaited, and I knew that patience, clarity, and empathy would be tested to their limits. Yet, within this crucible of tension, I also recognized the potential for growth, both personal and professional. The lessons learned, the choices made, and the ethical reflections cultivated during this stage would shape my conduct in the most critical moments yet to come. As I prepared for the next phase, a quiet determination settled over me. The coming challenges would not just test my skills as a diplomat, but also the depth of my conviction in the enduring value of dialogue, empathy, and the pursuit of peace amidst the chaos of war. The preliminary agreements were finally drafted, bringing a tentative sense of accomplishment to the negotiation table. Certain regions were designated for temporary ceasefires, and humanitarian corridors were acknowledged to allow aid to reach civilians trapped in the conflict zones. While these measures represented progress, the relief was tempered by the pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and the knowledge that trust remained fragile. I observed the delegations carefully as the terms were outlined. The Israeli representatives nodded politely, but their eyes betrayed continued wariness, scanning the room for any sign of deviation or hidden intent. On the opposite side, the Arab delegates acknowledged the agreements with measured expressions, yet subtle gestures, tightened fists, exchanged glances, revealed lingering doubts and the anticipation of testing the boundaries of the commitments. It was a delicate dance. Every movement and word carried meaning far beyond its surface. Internally, I felt a complex mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that some immediate measures had been agreed upon, and anxiety over the fragile nature of the accord. The battlefield continued to shift outside these walls, and even small miscalculations could unravel the progress painstakingly achieved. I reminded myself that this was not the conclusion, but rather a pause, a chance to stabilize and reassess before the next round of challenges emerged. I also noted my own reactions, a quiet pride in having navigated the first phase without major breakdowns, tempered by the realization that the path ahead remained treacherous. The temporary success served as both validation and warning. Diplomacy, I reflected, was an ongoing test of patience, judgment, and ethical vigilance. And while the agreements offered hope, the weight of responsibility had not lightened. If anything, it had deepened pressing me to remain vigilant and morally attentive in every subsequent decision. The days following the preliminary agreements were fraught with difficult choices. Reports continued to arrive from the field detailing areas where civilian casualties remained high and infrastructure was collapsing. It became increasingly clear that adhering strictly to strategic objectives without compromise would result in further suffering. Yet every concession carried its own risks. Yielding too much could undermine the credibility of the negotiations and embolden one side at the expense of the other. I found myself caught in a moral and professional dilemma. On one hand, my duty as a diplomat required that I maintain the trust and engagement of both parties, keeping the fragile talks alive. On the other, the human cost of inaction or rigid adherence to protocol loomed heavily. I wrestled with questions I had never fully faced. In previous assignments, how much compromise is too much? When does pragmatism become moral abdication? Consulting with my assistant and a small group of advisors, we debated potential courses of action. Could we propose a temporary adjustment in troop deployments to allow for safer passage of civilians? Should we suggest a minor territorial concession in exchange for immediate humanitarian access? Each option was weighed not only for its strategic viability, but also for its ethical implications. The discussions were long, punctuated by pauses where we reflected in silence the gravity of responsibility pressing upon us. In moments of solitude, I turned to my journal to process the internal conflict. I wrote of fear, doubt, and the immense weight of responsibility, but also of the resolve to act with integrity and compassion. I reminded myself that diplomacy in wartime is rarely clear-cut. It is a series of calculated choices made under duress, each carrying consequences that extend far beyond the negotiation table. As the hours passed, I made tentative decisions on which concessions to propose and which red lines to uphold. The process was exhausting and morally taxing, yet essential. I understood that the measure of success was not only in what agreements were reached, but in the lives those agreements could protect. In the crucible of these ethical and strategic dilemmas, I began to recognize the depth of both the challenge and my own capacity for perseverance, empathy, and measured judgment. Even as tentative agreements were in place, the reality of maintaining peace proved far more precarious than I had anticipated. New developments on the battlefield constantly tested the limits of the accords. Sudden troop movements in the Sinai and Golan Heights artillery exchanges near civilian areas and reports of displaced families fleeing conflict zones reminded everyone involved that the situation remained fluid and volatile. Negotiation was only one part of a much larger, unpredictable equation. During the sessions, both delegations began to push the boundaries of their initial concessions. The Israeli representatives, citing security concerns, proposed stricter control measures in key sectors, while the Arab delegates demanded rapid humanitarian interventions that, in their view, were non-negotiable. Each proposal threatened to unravel the delicate balance we had painstakingly achieved. I had to navigate these demands with extreme caution, ensuring that no comment or gesture appeared to favor one side over the other. Between meetings, I pored over intelligence reports and analyzed potential scenarios with my assistant and advisors. Every adjustment and negotiation strategy had to account for the ever-changing military situation. The challenge was not merely tactical, it was deeply human. Every decision had immediate repercussions for civilians caught in the crossfire. Roads blocked by armored vehicles, villages under artillery fire, and families living in temporary shelters reminded me that diplomacy existed not in abstraction, but in direct response to human suffering. Despite the constant pressure, I focused on maintaining composure and clarity. I attempted to frame proposals that were fair yet feasible, balancing the needs of civilians with the strategic objectives of the parties involved. Internally, I grappled with frustration and the knowledge that peace remained fragile. One misjudgment could ignite renewed conflict, erasing progress achieved over days of negotiation. Yet, even amid these challenges, I recognize a profound truth: diplomacy in wartime was not just about resolving disputes. It was about sustaining hope, mitigating harm, and preserving the possibility of a stable future. The very act of negotiation, even when outcomes were uncertain, carried the potential to save lives and prevent further escalation. This understanding became both my compass and my motivation, as I confronted the daily challenges of maintaining peace in an environment defined by chaos. Midway through the negotiations, an unexpected development threatened to upend everything we had worked for. Reports arrived that a sudden escalation had occurred along a key sector of the Sinai front. An armored column had advanced faster than anticipated, taking positions dangerously close to civilian settlements. The news was alarming. The temporary ceasefires and humanitarian corridors we had painstakingly secured were now under immediate threat. I convened an urgent meeting with my assistant and a small team of advisors. We assessed the implications the military escalation would complicate diplomatic efforts, jeopardize civilian safety, and potentially erode trust between the delegations. We debated possible responses, weighing the risks of pressing one side for restraint against the danger of appearing to favor the other. Every choice carried significant consequences, and the clock was ticking. Faced with this crisis, I had to make a decisive call. We drafted a revised proposal, an immediate localized pause in hostilities, coupled with the deployment of neutral observers to monitor civilian areas. The proposal was risky. It required swift acceptance by both parties, yet it was essential to prevent a catastrophe. I knew that if the delegations rejected the plan or if compliance was delayed, lives would be lost and the negotiation process could collapse entirely. Emotionally, the pressure was immense. Fatigue weighed heavily, and the moral responsibility for those potentially affected pressed on me like a tangible burden. In quiet moments, I reflected on the human cost families caught in the crossfire, children uprooted from their homes, and soldiers on both sides facing life or death situations. My resolve hardened, guided by the knowledge that diplomacy was the only viable tool to prevent further devastation. When the proposal was finally presented, I watched closely, observing every nuance of reaction. The delegations exchanged tense glances, their body language cautious yet receptive. It was a delicate balance, a test not only of negotiation skills but also of moral courage and ethical judgment. In that moment, I realized that the course of this conflict and the fate of countless lives rested on decisions made within these walls, decisions that demanded clarity, empathy, and unwavering commitment to the principles of humanity amidst chaos. The succession of crises, negotiations, and morally fraught decisions began to shape a deeper understanding of both the conflict and my own role within it. I realized that the idealistic notions I had brought into the mission, the belief that dialogue alone could swiftly resolve disputes, were insufficient when faced with the complexities of human behavior, entrenched positions, and the relentless pressures of war. Diplomacy was far more than strategy. It was a continuous negotiation with morality, empathy, and practical necessity. Each decision I made carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate room or table. A concession here might save lives, but risked undermining trust. A firm stance there might protect principles, yet imperil civilians. The balance between pragmatism and ethical responsibility became a daily, sometimes hourly consideration. I had to reconcile the limitations of influence with the aspiration to prevent suffering wherever possible. Through these experiences, I also observed the resilience and humanity of those around me. Delegates, while often obstinate and calculating, displayed moments of empathy, and even within rigid protocols, glimpses of shared concern for civilian welfare emerged. These instances reminded me that while war often amplifies distrust and cruelty, it does not entirely extinguish the capacity for compassion and reason. I found myself reflecting more deeply on the purpose of my work. It was no longer merely about representing my government or achieving temporary agreements. It had become about understanding the ethical weight of every negotiation, the profound responsibility that accompanied my words and actions, and the enduring significance of preserving human life amidst conflict. By the close of this stage, I felt a marked evolution in my perspective. I had learned to navigate complexity with greater patience, to weigh ethical implications alongside strategic objectives, and to maintain composure under pressure. The trials had instilled a nuanced sense of judgment, an awareness of moral ambiguity, and a recognition that true diplomacy required not only intellect and tact, but also courage, empathy, and unwavering ethical commitment. As the third phase of negotiations concluded, I could feel the gravity of the challenges that lay ahead intensifying. The tentative agreements and small concessions achieved thus far provided only a fragile veneer of stability. The underlying tensions and mistrust between the delegations remained unresolved. Reports of shifting troop positions, sporadic artillery exchanges, and the continued displacement of civilians underscored the impermanence of our progress. I spent hours reviewing notes, intelligence, and strategic options with my assistant and advisors, aware that each forthcoming decision could have far-reaching consequences. The lessons of prior days' ethical dilemmas, the delicate balance between compromise and principle, and the constant pressure of moral responsibility would be crucial in navigating the next phase. Every choice carried weight, demanding careful judgment and measured diplomacy. Internally, I braced myself for the looming turning points, sudden developments on the battlefield, unexpected resistance from one side, or new demands that could destabilize the fragile accord. The pressure was immense, yet it also reinforced the necessity of vigilance, clarity, and resilience. I understood that the coming days would not merely test negotiation skills, but also ethical resolve and emotional endurance. In these moments of reflection, I reaffirmed my commitment to the principles that had guided me from the start: empathy, integrity, and the pursuit of peace. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with potential peril, but the experience gained thus far had equipped me to face the challenges with measured determination and moral conviction. The next stage would demand everything I had learned and perhaps more than I could yet anticipate. The final round of negotiations brought a tentative conclusion to the mission that had consumed weeks of my life. After long hours of discussion, compromise, and careful wording, a formal agreement was reached. Certain sectors of the Sinai and Golan Heights were designated as demilitarized zones. Humanitarian corridors were officially sanctioned, and both delegations committed to monitoring mechanisms to prevent immediate escalations. It was, by any measure, a fragile success. As I observed the reactions of the delegates, I noticed the subtle interplay of relief and lingering caution. The Israeli representatives exchanged nods of acknowledgement but remained vigilant, aware of the potential for renewed tensions. The Arab delegates, while cautiously optimistic, continued to scrutinize every phrase as if seeking guarantees against future betrayals. The atmosphere was subdued, tinged with both accomplishment and skepticism, reflecting the delicate balance of trust that had been painstakingly negotiated. Internally, I experienced a complex mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride in having contributed to a tangible outcome that could prevent further suffering, and apprehension knowing that the agreement's stability would be tested in the days and weeks to come. The mission was not over in spirit. The consequences of every clause, every concession, would ripple through the lives of soldiers and civilians alike. Yet, for the moment, there was a quiet sense of relief, a recognition that diplomacy, however tenuous, had provided a measure of safety and a bridge toward a more hopeful future. Even as the agreement was finalized, the impact of the conflict weighed heavily upon me. Weeks of high stakes, negotiation, sleepless nights, and the constant awareness of lives at risk had left both physical and psychological marks. Fatigue lingered in my bones, and the relentless pressure had tested my resilience to its limits. Every detail of the battlefield, the displaced families, the destroyed villages, the wounded soldiers, remained vivid in my mind, refusing to fade with the conclusion of talks. Psychologically, I found myself grappling with residual anxiety and moments of self-doubt. Could I have done more to prevent suffering? Were there decisions I had made that, in hindsight, carried unintended consequences? These questions surfaced repeatedly, underscoring the moral weight of my role. Yet alongside the apprehension, there was also a quiet sense of accomplishment. The fragile truce represented a tangible achievement, a temporary reprieve that might save lives. Physically, the toll of constant vigilance, long hours of deliberation, and high stress manifested in persistent exhaustion and restless nights. My body reminded me that the intensity of diplomacy in wartime was not only mental but corporeal, exacting its own price. Through it all, I became increasingly aware that the experience would leave a lasting imprint, not merely as memories of negotiations or reports, but as a deeply personal understanding of the costs of war. The conflict had shaped me both as a diplomat and as a human being, embedding lessons that would guide my conscience and decisions far beyond the immediate crisis. As the dust of negotiations settled, I found myself reflecting deeply on the magnitude of the responsibility I had carried. The decisions made during those intense weeks had ramifications far beyond the walls of the conference room, affecting the lives of countless civilians, soldiers, and entire communities. I understood more clearly than ever that diplomacy was not merely a strategic exercise. It was a moral endeavor, one where every word and action could tip the balance between harm and relief. I pondered the limitations of my influence. Despite best efforts, not all outcomes could be controlled, and not every suffering could be prevented. The recognition of these boundaries was sobering but essential. It underscored the importance of measured judgment, ethical consideration, and the humility required to navigate complex human conflicts. At the same time, I acknowledged the growth that had arisen from these challenges. Each negotiation, each crisis, and each moment of ethical tension had honed my ability to balance pragmatism with conscience. I realized that responsibility extended beyond immediate outcomes. It encompassed an ongoing duty to learn from the past, to anticipate consequences, and to act with integrity even under duress. In quiet moments, I contemplated the lessons of these experiences. The interplay of strategy, empathy, and moral vigilance had redefined my understanding of diplomacy. I recognized that true responsibility lay not only in the ability to influence events, but also in the commitment to bear witness to weigh the human cost and to uphold ethical principles amidst the chaos of war, beyond diplomatic successes or failures. The human suffering I had witnessed, the difficult choices I had made, and the fragile agreements I had helped forge all reinforced the enduring importance of empathy, ethical vigilance, and moral courage. The memories of those days, faces of civilians seeking refuge, soldiers navigating the fog of conflict, and the tense moments at the negotiation table would remain vivid, reminders of the stakes inherent in any act of diplomacy. I came to understand that the lessons embedded in these experiences were themselves a form of legacy. They served as a caution and a guide for future engagements, emphasizing that every negotiation carries human consequences, and that the pursuit of peace demands both strategic acumen and unwavering ethical commitment. Through it all, one message emerged clearly even amid chaos and conflict. The preservation of humanity, the recognition of suffering, and the dedication to ethical action are what ultimately endure. The memories of this period would not only shape my own conscience, but could serve as a testament to the enduring power of reflection, responsibility, and compassion in guiding choices long after the conflict has ended. As I finally returned from the conflict zone, a profound sense of reflection settled over me. The journey from initial idealism to the harsh realities of negotiation and war had transformed my understanding of diplomacy, morality, and human responsibility. I recognized that the lessons learned were not merely professional, they were deeply personal, shaping the way I viewed the intersection of power, ethics, and compassion. I thought of the countless lives touched by decisions made within the walls of conference rooms and in the chaos of the battlefield. Each choice, each compromise, carried weight far beyond its immediate context, and the human stories behind the statistics remained with me, a constant reminder of the stakes involved in even the smallest diplomatic gestures. In closing, I realized that the measure of my role was not only in agreements reached or crises mitigated, but in the commitment to act with integrity, empathy, and conscientious judgment. The memories of this period, both harrowing and illuminating, would continue to guide my actions and inform my understanding of the fragile yet enduring potential for peace. Even in the shadow of war, I carried forward a renewed appreciation for dialogue, humanity, and the enduring responsibility we bear toward one another.